We are well into the release of the Mythical Island expansion in Pokemon Pocket, so it's time for an updated metagame tier list. Let's go ahead and sort the most common decks by their power level and talk about why each is getting the rating it does. We kick off our A tier with what, in my opinion, are the three pillars of our format: Pikachu EX, Mewtwo EX, and Gyarados EX featuring Greninja. These three deck lists tend to be the most popular registered in our tournament gameplay and have the most favorable spread of matchups against the rest of the field. Among our highest tiered decks, I would give the smallest of edges to Pikachu EX as likely the best deck in our current format, in my opinion. This deck list does something objectively powerful pretty consistently, cracking for 90 damage as soon as you get your second energy on your deck's namesake. It has a polarizingly favorable matchup into Gyarados, one of the other pillars of the format, and against the third, Mewtwo, it holds its own with a roughly 50-50 matchup table if both players are playing at a similar level. In my opinion, the strongest variation of Pikachu EX is this one playing Zebstrika. Zebstrika's ability to attack your opponent's bench is crucial in the Gyarados matchup and also shines against the variety of other lower tier decks that are looking to set up their big attacker behind a copy of Druddigon. Being able to poke down your opponent's backline when your aggressive attackers to start aren't good gives you a huge edge. Almost all of the Zebstrika Pikachu deck lists are playing these exact 9 Pokemon, but there's a ton of variation in what supporting trainers are being played. Varying copies of Sabrina, Giovanni, Leaf, Potion, and even things like Blue all see play in top performing Pikachu deck lists. Moving on to Mewtwo EX, this appears to be the kind of 50-50 deck of our format. This means it has a pretty even or slightly favorable matchup into a majority of things you can expect to play against, with the one big asterisk being the Gyarados Greninja deck has an exceptionally strong matchup against Mewtwo. As far as deck list variation goes, most Mewtwo players are playing the 9 Pokemon you see on your screen, with a small number of them reaching for a second copy of Mew EX as a 6 basic. The trainers that are being played in this archetype have a ton of variation though. Professor's Research, Pokeball, and Mythical Slab being the only mainstays, and everything from X-Speed, Leaf, Sabrina, Blue, Giovanni, and even Red Card are all being played to support. Gyarados EX Greninja easily has the most polarized matchup table of our A tier deck list, regularly sporting an upwards of a 70% win rate against Mewtwo in a given tournament, but also being less than 30% to win against Pikachu EX, the two biggest decks in the format. This matchup polarization extends past the opponents in the top 3 though, with things like Celebi being quite strong for you, but things like Hitmonlee Marshadow being absolutely abysmal as well. The Gyarados archetype has the least variation between deck lists among the big 3. The 12 Pokemon are pretty set across everything, with the trainers only having 8 slots. We occasionally see people experimenting with cutting the second copy of Leaf or even Misty for things like Blue to try and get counterplay into things like Hitmonlee and Zebstrika, but it's not clear as of yet if making your matchups a little bit worse on average is worth trying to make your unwinnable matchups slightly better. Moving on to the B tier of our list, we have Marshadow Hitmonlee fighting variations, we have Celebi plus Exeggutor, we have Arcanine and Moltres featuring Mew EX, and we have non-Gyarados Greninja variations in a variety of flavors. None of the deck lists in this grouping have play rates as high as the 3 we talked about in the A tier, but they have decent matchups into a variety of things, and it's never a surprise to see any of them in the top performing deck list in a given tournament run. Celebi EX featuring Exeggutor EX is definitely the most popular deck list of these lower tiers, but I think it deserves its B rating in large part due to its matchup table. It has an absolutely abysmal matchup against Gyarados, it is unfavorable against Mewtwo, and it only has a little bit of an edge in the Pikachu matchup. This means it's a really poor choice in the 3 most popular decks of the format. That being said, it tends to be very strong into the everything else portion of the metagame, making it a phenomenal pub stomper that's going to beat up on a lot of the random things that you're going to queue into in Pokemon Pocket. You should note that the Celebi deck list that I'm featuring here today is playing 2 Execute and 2 Exeggutor EX. This is not a mistake. The variations of Celebi that are not playing this third additional Pokemon line as a supplementary attacker have had abysmal performances overall, and as is often the case, playing more basics and having a more dynamic game plan that's not all in on doing a single thing tends to be more successful in competitive Pokemon Pocket. There are 3 primary variations of this Marshadow Hitmonlee fighting archetype that are seeing consistent success right now. The first of these is an 8 basic variation playing Tauros and Mew EX as your supplementary attackers. There is an Aerodactyl EX version using this as a finisher that doesn't dilute your starting pool of basic Pokemon that you get in your opening hand or pull with Pokeball. And there is a build that is giving up the Farfetch'd as a basic early piece of pressure in order to play the new Mankey and Primate from the Mythical Island expansion to apply a little bit more pressure, albeit a little bit less consistently since you need an evolution. These fighting variations are the absolute best lower tier deck for attacking the 3 decks we talked about in the A tier. They have an incredibly favorable matchup against Gyarados Greninja. They have a fairly favorable matchup into Pikachu EX, and they're a little bit of a dog against Mewtwo, but definitely still a winnable matchup that you can often outmaneuver your opponent by playing better than them. Subjectively, I would also put forward that I think this fighting archetype is the highest skill cap deck in Pokemon Pocket right now, playing a variety of single knockout point Pokemon with a ton of copies of X Speed and Leaf gives you a lot of choices about how you maneuver your cards in and out and which knockouts to give up when to your opponent in order to trigger your Marshadow. I think this deck list is phenomenal if you're someone that likes to feel like you have a chance inside of every matchup and never like flipping coins with your Pokemon Pocket cards. Arcanine EX Moltres EX featuring Mew EX as an additional attacker actually has a pretty solid matchup table overall. It's very favored against Pikachu EX, it's a solid favorite over Mewtwo EX, and it also crushes Celebi EX a significant portion of the time. That being said, the big thing keeping its metagame share down and overall success is it has an absolutely abysmal Gyarados EX Greninja matchup that you really can't solve with the tools that Fire and Colorless cards currently have in Pokemon Pocket. As far as decklist variation goes in these Arcanine decklists, the 2 potions as well as the second copy of Sabrina are the things we see change most often. Some players are playing a second copy of Mew EX alongside a Budding Expeditioner, and others are playing the additional copy of Leaf to be able to maneuver your cards around as easily as possible. Our last archetype in the B tier is non-Gyarados Greninja variations, of which there is a wide range. We have a Fire Water Druddigon Tauros build, we have a Behem Psychic variation, and we have a build leveraging the Marshadow Hitmonlee fighting sub-package that we talked about a little bit before this. Greninja's ability to deal damage without any energy and the fact that it can attack with 1 colorless energy means it is a stellar candidate for playing in Pokemon Pocket's most competitive 2-color decks. Personally, I'm a big fan of the Druddigon Tauros variation. Having 4 100 HP frontlines give you a lot of time to set up against the more aggressive decks in the format like Pikachu, and Tauros EX, especially paired with Giovanni, clears a variety of EXs like Pikachu and Celebi in one shot, giving you reasonable play in both of those matchups. Some variation of this deck list play 1 Tauros alongside 1 Mew EX, and some of them even just add Mew as a 7th basic as a way to hedge the Mewtwo and Charizard matchups that can be a little bit more challenging otherwise. It's also worth noting that these 3 sample Greninja deck lists on the screen are not the only ones seeing play and regularly spiking tournaments. Things like Weezing and even Alakazam and Victory Bell occasionally show up. Greninja is definitely the premier card in Pokemon Pocket to try and splash into a 2-color deck with another card that doesn't mind a couple colorless energy that aren't its primary type. Moving along to our C tier, we have Weezing Scolipede, Gyarados Starmie, Charizard Moltres, and Blaine deck variations. The deck lists in this tier tend to have one or maybe even two favorable matchups against decks in the upper tiers, but they're going to struggle with a lot of the others. They also are deck lists that are often budget things like Wheezing and Blaine that don't require nearly as many EX cards to be constructing. Using Scolipede was a deck that looked like it had a lot of promise during our first week of the Mythical Island expansion, but it soon became apparent that while this deck list tends to have a very favorable Mewtwo EX matchup, it struggles a lot against Pikachu decks, and it's also pretty poor against Gyarados. It also has a hard time with other B tier deck lists like Celebi and the fighting variations that are on the rise. This deck list doesn't have a ton of flex slots since it wants to play a stage 2 evolution line, Wheezing alongside Koga, and then obviously Professor's Research and Pokeball. This leaves our last Pokemon slot, Mew EX, in the sample list that is sometimes substituted out for a Tauros to help hedge that troublesome Pikachu matchup, as well as the 2 copies of X-Speed that are regularly played as Leaf, which is a little bit more restrictive as a supporter, but has the benefit of working better with our high retreat cost Pokemon like Venipede and Wheezing. Gyarados EX Starmie EX featuring Vaporeon as a way to shuffle your water energies around has a lot of parallels to its more popular cousin in the A tier, that Gyarados Greninja deck. It still has a very strong matchup into Mewtwo, and it actually has a much less bad matchup against Pikachu EX decks, albeit still not a good one. That being said, this benefit against Pikachu comes at a real cost of it being significantly worse in the mirror match, with the Greninja Gyarados deck beating the Starmie variation a significant portion of the time. Charizard EX Moltres, Metagame Titan, and Big 3 member from our pre-Mythical Island format has tumbled down a lot. This archetype has an absolutely abysmal matchup against all 3 of our A tier decks, being bad against Mewtwo, Gyarados, Greninja, and Pikachu. That being said, it does still hold something of a pub stomper title, being fairly strong into basically everything else that we're talking about in today's video. If you can dodge those big 3 matchups, or just want to feel especially powerful when you are winning, this deck list could still be a fine choice for you. It's noteworthy that our sample deck list here is playing the full 2 Growlithe and Arcanine EX as a secondary attack plan. While not all of these deck lists play 2 and 2 on this line, most of them are playing at least 1 Growlithe and 1 Arcanine, so you have something to do that's not just all in on Charizard for when that stage 2 doesn't fully come together. Lane variations are definitely Pocket's premier budget deck list, not requiring any 3 diamond cards to be playable. The matchups for this deck list leave a little bit to be desired in our current format, though, struggling against both the Gyarados Greninja decks and Mewtwo from our top tier. Our stats show that this deck list is likely a little bit favored, at least against Pikachu, but not by a significant enough margin to make up the fact that you're an absolute dog to the other 2 popular decks in the format. Most of the Blaine variations are only playing for basic Pokemon, but some of them are choosing to play the new copy of Magmar as an additional attacker, who's noteworthy because it plus Blaine does clear a Celebi EX in a single go thanks to the fire weakness. They've all adopted the Mythical Island version of Ponyta as the superior basic, but they're a little bit split on whether or not they should be playing 2 copies of the old Rapidash to have a consistent 1 energy attacker, or splitting their Rapidashes between one of the old and one of the new. We finally get to the Dragonite tier, or the D tier, in our video, which features its namesake as well as recently added to the metagame Golem from the Mythical Island expansion. While the Golem deck is definitely a little bit better than Dragonite, I do think it's still pretty mediocre overall and has a lot of the same issues that the Dragonite deck does, of just being hyper inconsistent. While the Golem deck doesn't suffer from being a 2-color deck, it essentially is a 4-card combo, needing your full stage 2 plus a copy of 2 of Brock to really get online before it gets run over by much of the format. The Dragonite deck is just an RNG incarnate. You need the right 2 colors of energy, you need your stage 2, you need your Draco Meteor to hit the right things on the board. It's not ever been competitive and likely won't ever will be either. All in all, I gotta say, the early Mythical Island metagame of Pokemon Pocket has shaped up to feel truly great. While we have 3 decks that are definitely more popular and perhaps a touch more powerful than the other things that are going on, I don't think any of them have a supremely dominating presence that you aren't able to attack. Things in the B tier are definitely things that can punch up and you can find success with if you're playing them well and you know your matchups. I would love feedback on the format of this video. I tried to do my best to cover the information that I felt was relevant to you all, like the variations that these deck lists can have and what their matchups look like, without having to read you every individual card in the deck list. As always, I would love to hear from you what I could do better in the future down below. If you haven't done so already, I'd also ask you to smash that like button. If you happen to be new here, consider subscribing to the channel. If you're not familiar with me, my name is Jeff Hoagland. I've been making card game content on the internet for the last decade, playing Magic the Gathering, Marvel Snap, and lots of others before this. I have a graduate degree and undergraduate degree in mathematics, so you're going to find my content is very analytically focused, and I love to teach here on YouTube just like I used to in the classroom. If that's your cup of tea, make sure you come back again sometime, and hopefully your next pack is an excellent one.